There is a huge variety of knitting needles available to us these days. We have different types of wood and metal ones and carbons and plastic, acrylic, all kinds of needles available. You can choose between straights or circulars, swivel cables, regular cables, interchangeables, fixed circulars, double pointed needles, different length of needle tips, different length of straight needles. The choice can be quite overwhelming, especially if you are new to knitting or you've returned to knitting after a break, or you are still using knitting needles that you've had for a long time, or knitting needles that you've inherited from older knitters in your family. You might find the choice of knitting needles today a bit overwhelming. So in today's video, I thought I would go through some of the options that are available today and how to pick the right knitting needles for you, because a lot of knitting needles these days are not cheap. Obviously you can get cheap needles, but in my experience those are best avoided. I prefer the slightly more expensive needles because I think they're better quality, but there is a lot available, and sometimes it can be difficult to make a decision. And I often see people asking online which ones are your preferred needles. Just because I prefer brand A to brand B doesn't mean that you're going to agree with me. So it is worth to weigh up your options, and today I'm going to talk about the different options available and how you can choose the best ones for you without making expensive mistakes. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. I've been knitting for as long as I can remember. I don't remember learning to knit, but I know I was probably a fairly young child as I learned to knit. And I used to knit a lot growing up in Norway, especially as a teenager in the 80s. I used to knit a lot. And then I had a break from knitting for a few years when I first moved to the UK. And then when I got back into knitting, I was really just relying on my local yarn shop, which didn't have a lot of choice. Their choice were very limited to some fairly basic plasticky needles that I didn't particularly like, and straight needles. They're mostly straight needles. I think they had some circulars, but I struggled to get circulars. And then I discovered online yarn shops, and I was able to have more choice of needles. But even back then, so we're talking nearly 20 years ago, there wasn't the choice there is now. And when I first started teaching workshops, most people who came to my workshops wanted to knit with straight needles. And these days, most people who come to my workshops knit with circular needles. But the good thing these days is that there's such a variety of choice in different materials, straight, circulars, different price ranges from quite cheap to very expensive. So you can find whatever suits you, and the most expensive needles may not be the best ones for you. So let's go through a few options of what you want to think about when you choose the best needles for you. I do have reviews on my YouTube channel of different brands of needles. I mostly review the circular needles because that's exclusively all I use. So all the reviews are really based on the circular needles, and in many cases interchangeable needles. Interchangeable needles are needles where you can screw the tip off the needle. So let me just see if I find a pair here that I can screw up. So the tip can be screwed up from the cable, which means that you can mix and match different cables to different needles. And they are quite useful because you need fewer tips and fewer cables to be able to make the combinations of needle size and length that you need to work your project. So I do have reviews on my channel of needles from Knit Pro, several of the Knit Pro needle types, including Symphony, Carbons, the Mindful collection, the Zing ones. I think they're the main ones I've reviewed. I think I've got two different videos because the Mindful collection is a separate video. I have review videos on Lantern Moon needles, on Chowgu, Haya, and Lykke. Lykke needles are quite often pronounced Lykke, and they are these really pretty colourful wooden ones. and they're very nice, but again they're a little bit more expensive. So I'm going to go through different options here and what you want to think about when you choose needles that are suitable for you and your project. The only thing you have to decide is, do you want to go for straight needles or do you want to go for circular needles? I don't have a lot of straight needles. I have some shorter ones for my workshops if anyone do want to use straight needles in my workshops. I used to always bring my own needles for workshops, and now mostly people bring their own needles, but I always bring my workshop needle bag just in case people don't have suitable needles. And I do have a set of the Nipro carbons in here in the shorter straight length for anyone who don't like circular needles, but most people are using circular needles these days. You can also get straight needle in metal ones. These are from an American brand who I believe no longer exists. They're called Signature needles. They're incredibly pointy, and I've ordered them from the States many years ago because they weren't available in the UK, and for some reason I decided to go for 4mm short straight ones, which I never use straights. I should have gone for a 4mm 80cm long circular needle, and I would have used them a lot, but these I rarely ever use. I used to occasionally use them for knitting swatches because the needle tips are very pointy and I really like them, but I just don't use them because I don't use straight needles very often, and considering the fact that they were quite expensive, that was definitely a mistake on my part. I should have gone for an 80cm long circular needle because 80cm long circular needles, 4mm is probably my most used needle type and size. But I made a mistake, and I also bought a set of double pointed needles, which I did used to use a lot for sock knitting, and they were the size I needed for sock knitting, but these days I do all my sock knitting on magic loops, so I haven't used those for a long time either. So an expensive mistake to make. So the first thing you need to think about is, do you want circular needles, do you want straight needles? Circular needles are more popular these days, I would say, than straight needles. Although if you own a yarn shop, you may argue with me and say more people are buying straight needles. I'm basing this on the people that I see in my workshops and the people who follow me on social media and comment on things I post about needles. In my workshops now, far more people are using circular needles than they used to, and I think that's because of the interchangeable needles available now, which I'll talk about in a minute. Circular needles are used for knitting in the round, but they can also be used for knitting back and forth. You just treat them like a straight needle, so you treat each needle tip as a separate needle. They just happen to be attached, so you knit across, and when you finish you just turn and knit back again like you would with straight needles. It's just they happen to be attached to each other, and I much prefer that because when you finish knitting you can pull your stitches onto the cable part of your needle and they're not going to fall off your needle tips as easily. They are smaller, I can fit them into fairly small project bags. I don't have to have a project bag that's long enough to cope with my long straight needle, and when I'm knitting with them I'm not ending up with my elbows out here and all the weight hanging on off one needle or the other as I'm knitting. The weight is more central and much more comfortable to knit with, in my opinion. So I never actually use straight needles anymore. But if you like straight needles, there are loads of different varieties available. Pro, for example, do straight needles in wood. Their symphony needles are wood. I'm sure they probably also do bamboo. They do metal, they do carbons, which is this kind of material, this black material, and they're very nice to knit with. And they used to do acrylic ones. They may also do plastic ones, I'm not sure. If you want circular needles, you then have to choose between fixed circulars and interchangeable circulars, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But let's talk about materials first. So there is a huge range of material. I used to use bamboo needles a lot when I first got back into knitting because they were very comfortable to hold, they weren't too slippery. I used to especially use them a lot for socks. I had a big case full of double pointed bamboo needles in size 2.5mm for socks, and they all ended up slightly bent because it is a softer wood and they will flex slightly, and for the thinner ones they may end up bending. They will also snap quicker if you sit on them or catch them in something. I had some Licker wooden needles, which are I don't know what kind of wood they are actually, but they're wooden ones. I'd ordered some 2.5mm circular ones to use for sock knitting, and I was at a conference in London and I put my sock project in my backpack, and went off for the day to this conference where I was planning to knit all day while listening to the talks. And when I got there and pulled my project out, my needle tip had snapped because 2.5mm is quite thin, and because it's wood, it does, I must have just shoved it and had too much in my bag and it broke. And then after the conference I was scrambling around trying to find a yarn shop that I could get to quickly enough and easily enough on public transport in London to buy a new circular needle so I could knit the next day, because it was the only project I had with me on this trip, which is another rookie mistake. You always bring a couple of options with you when you're away for several days. Wood ones are nice. They're usually recommended for people who have problems with their hands like arthritis. They feel warmer to the touch and they are a little bit flexible. Carbon fiber is also quite warm to the touch. As far as I know, the only needles I've seen that are made in carbon fiber are from Nipro, and they're black, this carbon fiber, and then they have metal tips. So this is a double pointed one, but their circular ones have metal tips, and it's a nice warm material to hold, but you get the advantage of metal tips, and they are fairly pointy. They're also a little bit more expensive than the regular Nipro Symphony ones, which are the wooden ones. So the Symphony ones are this kind of wood, so it's a darker wood, but it's got a bit of brown and green, a little bit of like a purpley colour in there. So there again are darker colours. And then you've got the bamboo ones, and we also have the ebony wood from Lantern Moon, but these are either very dark brown or black. And then Liquid do like a driftwood, I think these are called, like a natural wood. They do these really lovely blue ones and these pink ones. Now, the colour of your needles does make a difference depending on what you're knitting. If you're knitting something dark, using a darker needle can make it difficult to see your stitches. So sometimes having a contrast between your yarn and your knitting needles is a good idea, because it makes it easier to see your stitches. If I was knitting with a dark colour and this dark needle, it would be much more difficult to see my stitches than if I was knitting with a lighter wood. So with wooden ones, because they come in all these different colours and types of wood, and some woods are more expensive than others, it is worth thinking about the colour and the types of wood that you like knitting with, and also, you know, what's in your budget, what are you willing to pay for this. And just think about the darker woods. If you knit with a lot of darker yarn and your eyesight isn't great, which obviously is quite often a problem as we get older, we need brighter lights and more contrast. At least I find that's the case with me. You may find the darker woods a little bit difficult to knit with, although I use my Lantern Moon all the time and I really like it. There's also plastic needles and acrylic needles. So I don't know whether Nipro still do them, but they used to do some acrylic needles that came in loads of different colours, so that each size was color coded, and I bought a set of them, in circular ones, and I hated them. They were okay for some yarns, but with some yarns, they would just sound really squeaky and I didn't like them. So I eventually got rid of them. No idea what's happened to them. I must have just given them away maybe at some point, but I really didn't like them. A lot of like the cheaper needles that are aimed at children or given away as freebies with magazines, and also the cheapest ranges that some yarn shops sell, I don't think are worth knitting with, especially the circular ones. Sometimes the joins between the cable and the needle tip is awful, and other times the material is just unpleasant to knit with. So it is worth investing in some slightly better ones, even if they seem expensive to you. Metal ones, you can get colored metals. So these are the Nipro Zing ones. They're color coded, so each size come in a different color. These ones have dark cables, but I don't know, these are quite old. I don't know if the new ones have dark cables. These ones are, hang on, these ones are not interchangeable. These are fixed because they are 2.5mm, I think, for sock knitting. Well, that's what I use them for, and they are fixed circulars, so you can't screw the tips off. Nipro do now do a huge range of different types of cables in all kinds of different colors. So if you don't like the black cables and you can get the interchangeable tips, you can choose different cables. These are also Nipro. I don't know what these are called, but these are metal ones. And again, I think these are 2.5 or 2.75. I can't read what it says because I'm wearing contact lenses and my eyesight is not as good with contact lenses. But these actually have, can you see how they're alternating in color? These sections are actually can be used for measuring, and I think it's also marked all the way down the needle, all the way down the cable, although I can't see that now because I'm got my reading glasses here. Each of these sections are 2 centimeters. If you need to measure something on the go, you can use these to measure with. I've never actually used them for that, but I think that's the idea. I don't know whether they're still sold. They were very popular a few years ago. You can also get silver metal ones. These are Chowgu. I think they're like a brushed stainless steel or something. They are quite smooth and nice to nip with, but metal ones are harder and they can feel a bit colder, although I've never had a problem with these. But I do know a lot of people who have problems with their hands, like arthritis, do find the metal ones a bit more uncomfortable to nip with. They find that they get more pain knitting with them and prefer wooden ones. There's also some from Prim. They Prim? Yes, they're Prim ones. These are ergonomic needles, and I don't actually know what this material is, but it feels like plasticky. They're quite flexible, and these are ergonomic needles. They're not interchangeable, they are fixed ones. They have like really weird tips. See if you can see it. I don't know how easy it is to see it. They are kind of like spatula shape almost. I do have a video on these because when I first got them, I was like, I don't know whether these are any good, but I did actually enjoy knitting with them. I haven't bought any more just because I don't really need them, but I do occasionally use these. They do mainly tend to live in my workshop bag now, but I have used them quite a few times to knit swatches and things, and I do like them. I didn't think I would, but I actually like them more than I thought I would. But I do have a separate video on those and my views on them and what they claim. But they claim to be ergonomic. Not quite sure what makes them ergonomic, but that's what they're claiming. There's a lot of variety of materials for you to choose from. Just look at different options and try different options and decide what works for you. Now let's talk about fixed circular needles versus interchangeable circular needles. So fixed circular needles are needles where the tip doesn't unscrew. So the tips and the cables are fixed. And you can get the cables in different lengths. So the length of the needle refers to the whole length of the needles. So from needle tip to needle tip. So when you're buying and you can get circular needles in the fixed ones where the cables are attached to the needle tips, and the interchangeable ones where you can screw the needle tips off. These are screwing too tightly. I can't screw them off. Let's see if I can find a pair that I can screw off. Yeah, these come off. These are Chowgu ones, and different brands have different ways of attaching them. All the ones that I've got are screwed on, and then you have a little key that you stick in a little hole here and use as a lever to push against to tighten it. And that's very important that you make sure you tighten your needles properly so they don't unscrew as you use them. Addy needles are different. They have a kind of click adjustment where the needle goes onto the cable metal bit and you just click them in place. I do have a review video on those that I did, I think last year. I don't actually use them because I didn't like them. I find the click fastening really difficult, and I have found that I can't always fasten them properly. And I had 3 different tapes and cables and actually gave them away to somebody last weekend who really likes Addy needles, and they're also not pointy enough for me, so I wasn't a fan of those. But they're the only ones of the needle brands I've reviewed on my channel that I really didn't like. But I know people who love them, so it's worth trying, especially if you struggle with the screw-on fastening mechanism. It is, because they can unscrew, it is worth trying the Addy ones and see if you like them. So when it comes to choosing interchangeables versus fixed circular needles, I would say if you're going to get circular needles, you may as well get the interchangeable ones, because you have the options of different length cables with different sized needle tips. So if you need a short 4mm needle or long 4mm needles, you can just switch them around, and it's much more flexible. So you need less needles rather than having a 4mm 80cm long and a 40cm long 4mm circular. You can just have the 4mm needle tips and then screw them onto different length cables. And then if you need the 3.5mm whatever length circular needle, you can unscrew your 4mm ones and screw on your 3.5mm ones. And they're especially good for projects where you're using different needle tips. So if the rib is done on one needle tip, you can knit a rib, unscrew those needle tips, screw the new ones on, and carry on knitting your sweater rather than changing to a completely different circular needle. So I would recommend, if you're going for circular needles, to go for the interchangeable ones. You can buy them individually, so you can buy the needle tips and the cables separately, or you can buy them in sets. The sets come in various sizes, so you can get sets that only cover certain sizes, and you can get sets that cover the whole range. So do look at what's offered. The ones that cover the whole range cost a lot more money. And they may sound like a good idea because you don't have the whole set, and they quite often come in a case for you to store them in. And you might think, well, then I'll have all the needles I might ever need. But think about which needle sizes you normally use. When the CharGu interchangeable set first came out, I bought the whole set. But I hardly ever use the larger sizes, so I rarely use anything over a 4mm, maybe occasionally a 4.5 or a 5mm, but anything bigger than that I never use. I can't remember the last time I reached for a needle size that was bigger than 4.5, 5mm in circumference. So I actually took out the bigger sizes in my my CharGu interchangeable needle case and put them somewhere else because I just never used them, and then I had more space to fit in all my other needle tips that I use all the time. And CharGu, I'm assuming is still the case, but you used to be able to buy just the smaller sizes or just the bigger sizes, and I should have just gone for the smaller sizes because I just don't use the bigger sizes. But I guess if I need them, I've got them, so I guess that's a good idea. But buying the whole set can be quite expensive, and if you're not sure whether you're going to like them or not, it may be a waste of time for you. So I would recommend, unless you really know which needles you want and which needles you like, I would not buy the entire set. Yes, it does save you money overall if you buy a lot of them, but you do have to make sure that you're really going to like them if you buy them. So I would buy the individual needle tips and cables and build up my own set, because then you can do it over time and buy them as you need them. And you can also just buy a needle tip, a set of needle tips and a cable. Try it, see if you like them. If you don't like them, you've only bought one, it's not that much money. If you do like them, then you can buy more and build up your own set in the sizes you need, and you can do that over time. If you have knitting friends that you can borrow from, that might be a good idea. If you have a local yarn shop that stock them and they have one, so you can try and store, maybe you'll be able to go in, try some needles, sit there and knit with them for a little bit and see if you like them. That might be an option worth asking about as well. So as you can see, there are loads of different options when it comes to needles these days, in the different types, materials, circulars, interchangeables, fixed circulars, straights, double point needles. So much choice. I have several videos on my channel where I review different needle brands and what I think of them and if I like them or not. And I also have a video where I talk about the how and why of circular needles. So why might you want to choose circular needles, what can you knit on circular needles, and how do you use them? So how to knit in the round on circular needles, how to knit flat on circular needles, how to do magic loop, and how to use traveling loop to knit in the round. And I also have I think I have a separate video on magic loop as well. And then recently I did a video on swivel cables for circular needles because they've become very popular in the last few years and most people like them, but not everyone. So I give you my opinion on swivel cables in a recent video. I will link my circular needle and needle review playlist below, and the swivel cable video below as well, and also at the end of this video. Do go and check it out and let me know which needles you like. Let me know which brands you like, which materials you like. Do you use circular, straights? Tell me in the comments what your preferences are, and also if you can tell me why you like those, because it might help other people choose as well. And remember, just because everyone likes a certain needle brand doesn't mean you're going to like them. My favorite needles are Chow. I use them the most, but I also like Lantern Moon, which are the ebony wood dark ones. I also like Liquor, but I don't like the cables for the Liquor needle tips. And the Liquor, Nipro and Lantern Moon needle tips all fit onto the same cables. So I quite often use my Lantern Moon cables for my Liquor needle tips because they all fit each other's cables and needle tips, which is quite useful. Chow-Goos don't. They can only fit the Chow-Goo ones. So leave your comments below, let me know what you think, and if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.